Welcome, everyone, to the CogX Hybrid Festival 2021. I'm Christine Foster, CCO at the Alan Turing Institute, and we're the UK's Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, and we're just nearby in the British Library. I'm coming to you remotely today and expect to be there in person in the coming days. In the next 3 days, we're going to be addressing the question, how do we get the next 10 years right? There are CEOs, entrepreneurs, academics, artists, activists, policymakers, all working to realize the biggest transformational opportunities of our time and addressing the challenges along the way. We're delighted that you're with us. And so please use this platform over the next 3 days. You can see who's online, you can chat with them, you can invite them to a video call, and you can visit a fantastic online exhibition. So explore away. I'm so pleased that the Turing will be presenting some key sessions across the festival. So do have a look out for AI and Financial Services, which is in collaboration with the FCA today. That'll be at noon today on the research stage. Tomorrow on the CreaTech stage, there will be Andrea Baroncelli, who is the Turing's Economic Data Science theme lead, talking about non-fungible tokens, NFTs, and the future of digital art. And on Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. on the Global Leadership stage, Sir Adrian Smith, the Turing's Institute Director, will join a panel on what the UK needs from a national AI strategy. And finally, one of our own Turing board members, Vanessa Lawrence, will join the panel for the session, Reinventing the High Street with Geospatial and Place-Based Innovation. That'll be Wednesday at noon on the Planet and Smart City stage. So that's all across the festival. You'll see Turing people and our work. Now, this research stage is actually organized with the support of a fabulous group of editorial partners. We have Springer Nature, the global publisher that helps authors share their discoveries and enables researchers to understand the work of others. We have the Digital Catapult, who is the UK's leading agency for the early adoption of advanced digital technologies. And we have the Alan Turing Institute, the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. And so I'm personally delighted to be with you on this research stage today because it's so fundamental to what we do at the Turing. We're going to start our keynote in a moment. I would like to tell you that on social media, the hashtag we're all using is hashtag CogX 2021. Again, that's hashtag CogX 2021. Our keynote today is an exciting one, curated with Springer Nature. The future of research lies in collaboration. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the editor-in-chief of Nature, Dr. Magdalena Skipper.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Christine. Thank you very much for the introduction. And of course, it's a great delight to be here. I believe both Christine and I are in London, although of course, we are joining all of you virtually from our homes today, I think. So I am editor-in-chief of Nature, as Christine said, and Nature is a weekly international multidisciplinary journal that publishes original research, but also research science-related news. And today, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of collaborations. Not surprisingly, I will focus on science, on research, but as you will see, I will touch on a couple of other areas. So if I can have my presentation, please, I will kick off with that. Thank you very much. So you may be forgiven for thinking that science is primarily done by individuals, because after all, that's the image that science and research often projects. Think of how we acknowledge individuals who've made important contributions to science. Indeed, we acknowledge individuals. Think of Nobel Prizes. They are, of course, given to individuals. Usually it's 2 or 3 of them. But those individuals, of course, represent groups. And in fact, it's notable that throughout the history of this particularly famous set of prizes, the Nobel Prizes, it's only the Peace Prize that has been awarded to a group, but that group recognition has never taken place in the sciences, for which, of course, Nobels are also awarded. And so on this slide, I'm showing you images of real-life researchers, scientists, individuals who have contributed to research. And I first put together this slide about 2 years ago when Nature was celebrating its 150th anniversary. It was striking to me how the kinds of researchers who contribute to the advancement of research, who worked a long time ago when Nature was first published, who they were and who the researchers who contribute to research today are. And indeed, our pages reflect that evolution. But of course, there is something fundamentally missing about this slide. Yes, these individuals do science, they contribute to science, but the reality is really this. Science is done by teams of individuals. Yes, individuals may drive a particular set of experiments or have particular ideas, but all of that happens in a context of collaboration, background knowledge, colleagues either within the same laboratory or the same research group, or indeed from other academic institutions, perhaps private sector, or from outside of the core research establishments. That is more of a reality. And how that transition, from the very early key research figures, for example, you will perhaps recall that one of the individuals I was showing on the slide was Isaac Newton. How that evolution, or how that change has come about from the time when really individuals drove discovery through to today is a subject of active study in research. Here's one such example that looked at how team science, doing research in teams, is becoming more prominent, coming into dominance. The two graphs you can see on my slide are taken from this particular publication. And what you're looking at on the left-hand side is the proportion, the percentage of scientific output as measured by scientific publications with the black line, science and engineering, and with the orange line, social sciences. Notably, the blue line at the bottom, where the percentage has not changed dramatically, represents arts and humanities. And the red line is, in fact, patents. So, of course, another important contribution to research output. And you can see that proportion of teams has proportion of team science is increasing over time. And this is a particular time window of around 40 to 50 years that the authors looked at. And then on the right-hand side, on the right slide, you actually see the mean size of those teams. And you can see the size is increasing, particularly fast in science and engineering. That's a much steeper rise. This particular set of authors also found another interesting conclusion. The fact that individual authors did produce papers of what they call singular distinction in science and engineering and social sciences in the middle of the last century, in the 1950s. However, towards the millennium, what they call the extraordinary cited works, so really outstanding, impactful contributions, increasingly tend to be made by teams rather than individuals. Another interesting aspect of teams that I wanted to share with you was relatively recently published in this journal called Nature Human Behavior. So here the authors looked at what they call the freshness of the teams. And the way they define this is simply whether the members of the team have worked previously with one another or not. Well, it turns out from this particular study that in fact the originality, the impact, the originality of the study, and in fact multidisciplinarity is more likely to occur when teams come together for the first time, when they have not worked with one another before. And so, of course, as you saw from what I said already, collaboration is hardly a new concept, but undoubtedly it's increasing in frequency. And also, as we can see, when we look at impactful science, most impactful science, or more and more impactful science, science that really is either very highly cited or makes real impact in life, comes from collaborations. Well, of course, nothing focuses the mind like a common crisis. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about collaborations in the context of the study of the current pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. But this is, of course, not the only crisis that faces us. So I will also spend a few minutes talking about a couple of other ongoing crises, which right now, because of the pandemic, are a little bit less visible. You would probably think that when you look at subject areas in terms of research that contribute to providing new knowledge around the pandemic, it would mainly be medical and health sciences. And of course, when we talk about collaborations, one sort of axis of collaboration, if you like, is across disciplines. Well, you're absolutely right that, of course, most of the publications, and so this is in fact what I'm showing on this very simple slide, publications that have been published in the last just over a year, because I performed a very simple search for the purpose of the slide with the word COVID. And of course, COVID is a new term, only just over a year old. The vast majority of publications fall indeed within this discipline of medical and health sciences. But in order for us to understand the pandemic, come out of it, scientists and researchers from many different disciplines need to collaborate, and collectively we need to use the knowledge, the knowledge they generate. And so, for example, we have a very large proportion of publications in studies in human society, in psychology, basic science, both biological and physical sciences, in education, in information and computer science, economics, engineering, etc., even history. So many different disciplines need to come together in order for us to crack such a complex and an important problem such as the pandemic. And zooming in on one specific example in the context of the pandemic, one that I am particularly in awe of, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development timeline. So for your comparison, I'm showing you a sort of a generic timeline based on historic evidence. At the top of the slide, you see the traditional development pipeline for a vaccine. Normally, it takes some 15 years or longer to develop a vaccine, and there are many different stages, many different steps involved in this process. Now, if you look at the bottom of the slide, and of course, you don't have to tell me you don't have to listen to me to tell you that the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine was developed in unprecedented short time frame in just about 10 months. So the steps in the process were exactly the same, but each step was contracted as a result of open, accelerated information exchange. And of course, as I said before, a crisis focuses the mind. So as you can see here, clinical trials, the different phases of clinical trials took place in a sort of overlapping fashion. The regulatory review was much accelerated. But let me zoom in at the very beginning of this timeline. So in order to be able to develop a vaccine, we need to understand the disease agent, the virus itself. The disease was first announced at the very beginning, or in fact on the last day of 2019, but let's say the beginning of 2020. And through an incredible collaborative effort among scientists, the sequence of the virus was, first of all, the genome of the virus was sequenced. The sequence was made available, shared widely. And it's because of that sharing, and incidentally, that sequence was published within about a month of the disease first being described, published in peer review literature. That really is quite remarkable. And then just under 2 months later, the structure of the virus particle was solved and published, again in peer-reviewed literature. And it's the basis of that structure that then, or the structure formed the basis of development of the vaccine, kickstarting that whole extremely rapid 10-month process. And of course, having the vaccine, so knowing the molecular details of the virus itself and then developing the vaccine, having the vaccine itself would not necessarily be, would necessarily solve our pandemic problem. We, of course, need the people to take up the vaccine. And of course, we also need to make sure that the vaccine is widely available. So this is where the social sciences come in. Social scientists need to come and collaborate with basic scientists, with the clinicians, public health researchers, so that we all collectively understand what creates vaccine hesitancy. Why are people reluctant to accept a new vaccine? Without that collaboration and that understanding, the vaccine itself will not be as efficient because simply it will not be taken up by the population. And another example, my last example from the COVID-19 stable, if you like, is that of this collaboration or partnership between science and policy. Here, 3 examples of research papers. The first one from a journal called Nature Medicine, modeling the COVID-19 scenario as the disease develops in populations in the US. New data are being fed into the models and updated, and it's on the basis of this modeling that the US government is making decisions, for example, on the lockdowns, restrictions, on gatherings, opening up businesses, etc., etc. The example on the right-hand side, again from Nature Medicine, was in fact the piece of research, one of the pieces of evidence, again peer-reviewed pieces of evidence, that led to a change by the US CDC to now allow fully vaccinated individuals not to wear masks outdoors but also indoors, because scientific evidence provided sufficient evidence to suggest that they are no longer transmitting that many viruses, so they don't pose a threat in these situations. The third example on the slide is just over a year old now, but it was particularly instrumental here in the UK, where I am, where we had a concept of social bubbles. And so this was a study which, even before it was fully officially published in the journal, was shared with the government here, the governmental advisors, to introduce a concept of social bubbles. So a few individuals were able to continue to meet together even during lockdown without compromising the effectiveness of lockdown and dampening down the spread of the pandemic. So I mentioned at the beginning, of course, the pandemic is not the only crisis that faces us, and especially that interaction between policymakers and scientists, of course, is not just limited to the current ongoing pandemic. So Sustainable Development Goals are, of course, a set of goals set out by the UN. They were put in place for a period of 15 years, and we are looking to the end of the 15-year period in 2030. Even before the pandemic started at the beginning of 2020, I think we knew that we were going to struggle to meet the goals. Certainly now with the pandemic, as a result of the pandemic, a number of these goals are looking very shaky. And so the UN is deliberately looking to scientific advice from researchers to help modify, reset, recalibrate the goals to ideally maximize the opportunity for meeting as many of the sub goals as possible. This is a really important collaboration, an ongoing collaboration. While the goals are being, as I say, recalibrated, the researchers are providing the policymakers with analysis, data, and relevant modeling. So let me give you a couple of examples, real examples. The first one is that from the domain of the oceans. Here's an example of, in my opinion, an unprecedented collaboration between world leaders of 14 states, nation states, who specifically commissioned, if you like, an international group of researchers to help them decide where next for ocean economy. And at Nature and the Nature portfolio, we were fortunate enough to be able to publish a large part of this output. So the collaboration was known as the High Level Panel on Sustainable Ocean Economy. As I said, 14 nations came together. And as a result of the evidence that the researchers furnished them with, they have committed to sustainable management of 100% of the national waters by 2025 already. And in terms of the contribution to the global ocean, just to give you one example, these 14 nations represent something like 20% of all global fisheries. And there are different aspects to this, as you can see: ocean wealth, ocean health, finance, knowledge, and also, very importantly, equity. What was very important in this particular collaboration is that it wasn't just researchers and politicians and policymakers, but also other stakeholders, such as, for example, small-scale fishermen. Another example, which in many ways is similar, is the UN food agenda. So later this year, in the autumn, there will be a UN Food System Summit, which was called by the Secretary General. This example, again, the reason for me to choose it is because it wonderfully illustrates the importance and the necessity of collaboration between researchers, politicians, policymakers, but also, in this case, smallholder farmers, so that the research is appropriately directed, the policies are developed appropriately, and by appropriately, I mean so that they can actually make a real difference to smallholder farmers as well as large agricultural businesses. One aspect which illustrates that inclusivity in the design of the research and information gathering in the run-up to the UN food system is this Food Systems Summit Dialogues. It's a program of dialogues which has been running for quite some time now. These dialogues are local. They've happened in over 20 different countries, having brought together over 2,000 different stakeholders. So building up expertise, information from the ground up, if you like, in this very collaborative, consultative fashion, so that the outcome, the research, the policy can be better suited and therefore more successful. Historically, especially when I imagine that, especially when you think about research being done together with those individuals who are not trained, formally trained as researchers, you think of citizen science, where scientists perhaps, or you're likely to think of citizen science, where scientists perhaps involve members of the general public to collect data at some point. There are wonderful examples of that in astronomy or in biodiversity, for example. But increasingly, there is appropriate emphasis on co-production of research, where stakeholders in these collaborations enter collaborations at the very point of inception of research. So what kinds of questions are asked and how they are addressed is collectively designed with, for example, smallholder farmers or patients. Indeed, this is very appropriate to research which has real life tangible outcomes. But even in the case of some basic studies, for example, researchers who study adult autism increasingly work with autistic adults right from the very start of the research of these studies. One of the ways in which we as journal editors and as publishers try to support this increasingly collaborative way of doing science, cross-disciplinary, cross-sector, across stakeholder, is actually by creating new homes for this interdisciplinary research. And so, I said to you at the beginning that I am editor-in-chief of Nature, which is a multidisciplinary journal. For that reason, all of these studies all of these subject areas that I've talked about so far are in scope for the journal to consider. We certainly publish in these areas. But as part of the Nature portfolio, of which Nature is part of, we have also created other homes for multidisciplinary and indeed interdisciplinary research, such as, for example, Nature climate change, Nature energy, Nature sustainability, Nature food, and Nature human behavior. I mentioned one publication from Nature human behavior earlier. Each of these journals, each of these homes brings in practitioners of many different disciplines, or indeed those who increasingly define themselves as interdisciplinarians. When thinking about collaborations, it's really important to not only think about them as being inclusive. At some level, by the very definition, collaborations ought to be inclusive, but they must be equitable. All too often, we hear, certainly within research, that when collaborations are set up along the so-called global north, global south axis, there is lack of equity in these collaborations. It's important that researchers, funders, but also us, editors and publishers, as well as other stakeholders, think right from the very beginning that collaborations need to be equitable. So that, for example, when large funding opportunities are created for to study science or to support science that is designed to understand problems that face individuals in Africa, African researchers are involved in those studies right from the very beginning, and in fact, they drive the agenda. In that case, the studies are certainly bound to be more appropriate and have a more likely real impact on the ground. There are some simple things to think of when one thinks about equitable collaborations, such as, for example, respect of all collaborators, appreciating the different types of contributions that all collaborators bring. But also, one of the things which is very common in the, or commonly occurs in research is the so-called brain drain. So in collaborations, individuals might move from one geographic location to another, acquire expertise and knowledge in the new location, and then not be able, for whatever reason, to come back to return. So in setting up those collaborations, it's important to think about that provision and sort of brain flow, if you like, which is what, for example, the author of this particular study published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution talked about. And indeed, I gave you an example of how collaborations or equitable collaborations can be enabled by funders of research. And many funders increasingly are beginning to think about this. Here, two examples of large funding efforts from the NIH, National Institute of Health. Both, in fact, focused on setting up collaborations with and within Africa. So H3 Africa is looking at health, human health and heredity in Africa, understanding the genetic basis of disease and disease susceptibility, and harnessing data science for health discovery and innovation in Africa is another example, which right from the very beginning is designed to foster and support collaborations across disciplines and across geographies. Collaborations across geographies are not always very easy, or not as easy as they ought to be. Science research in itself, of course, knows no borders, and yet politics sometimes get in the way. My plea, I suppose, in the context of this presentation is that researchers themselves, but also actually the policymakers and researchers, whether they be in an academic institution or in the private sector, try and rise above these borders, these political, the political focus that may exist, that political focus should be left outside of science, outside of research, if we really are going to have collaborations that are designed to solve global problems that face us all. And of course, science already provides wonderful examples. You often hear of the sort of diplomatic power of science. Here's one example, and it's not a new example. This particular facility, Synchrotron Light for Experimental Science and Applications in the Middle East, has been established for a number of years. But look at this map. Look at the map where the researchers who have come to establish what's known as Sesame, where they come from. There are very few tables at which individuals from all these different countries can sit, come together, and peacefully discuss a common cause. This is a real power that science has. And my plea to all of you listening, engaging in research in whatever way, is to keep this wonderful example first and foremost at mind when thinking about global collaborations. And so, understandably, throughout my presentation, I focused on research-centered collaborations that bring different players, different stakeholders, but try and solve some science-focused problem. After all, so many global problems, and I mentioned the ongoing pandemic, I mentioned ocean sustainability, I mentioned food crisis, and more broadly, sustainable development goals. But there are some other wonderful examples of collaboration. Sometimes they come from surprising quarters. I'm sure you think of journalists as working as individuals, trying to get the scoop, get a story. Well, here's a wonderful example of a collaboration in journalistic world. You will probably remember the Panama Papers, a series of stories who came about as a result of a collaboration of more than 300 reporters right across the globe. And of course, they worked together to expose this hidden infrastructure and global scale of offshore tax havens. And very likely, the story would not have hit the headlines had these individuals worked individually as opposed to coming together in this journalistic consortium. Again, an illustration of how global issues, global problems require global collaborations, which bring many different experts together. So with this, I will stop, and I hope I've convinced you that that the future of research is collaborative, and that really is the only way then we can make a meaningful impact on the global stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magdalena. That's such a powerful message. And I felt I could hear the sort of bird song in agreement and accompaniment behind you. It's just lovely. We're in the same position. You know, we really subscribe to this at the Turing. We know there's all sorts of problems that can't be solved by an individual, and we can't sit around and wait for another Alan Turing to be born. Right? We have to be building these teams that can accomplish those breakthroughs. So thank you. Thank you for the challenge.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be here.
All right. Well, we'll continue building those teams as you suggest. Thank you so much, Magdalena. Well, that was a big start to the day, wasn't it? Our next session will start at 11 a.m. And in the meantime, there are these virtual expo booths and networking areas that you can go to during the break. Also, if you're minded to have your say about the future of the UK's national AI strategy, maybe even make some points about collaboration, there should be digital screens around with QR codes for a survey that's being run with the AI Council and the Turing. And I think the deadline, I know the deadline for that is the 20th of June. So there will be ways of completing that, lots of different channels to help you do that, but you should be able to contribute to the country's national AI strategy that way. And so with that, leave you with a break and see you at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much.